Hello and welcome to Nap to History, a quiet space where we slow down and let the past unfold one soft story at a time. Tonight, we'll gently wander through the harsh realities of slavery in ancient Greece, not to memorize dates or terms, but to feel the echoes of lives once lived in bondage. Whether you're lying down for the night or just taking a moment to breathe, I'm really glad you're here. If you find comfort in calm, thoughtful history, feel free to subscribe. There's always another peaceful chapter waiting. Before we begin this journey back in time, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and share if you enjoy calm historical storytelling like this. Let's take a moment to set the stage. Ancient Greece, a civilization often celebrated for its contributions to philosophy, democracy, and the arts, flourished from roughly the 8th century BCE to 146 BCE, when Rome conquered the region. While we admire the Parthenon, study the words of Socrates, and marvel at the Olympic Games, there existed a darker foundation upon which Greek society was built, the institution of slavery. In this documentary, we'll explore the harsh realities faced by enslaved people in ancient Greece, examining their daily lives, legal status, and the profound suffering that underpinned what many consider the cradle of Western civilization. Our journey begins with understanding how one might become enslaved in ancient Greece. Unlike the racially based slavery of more recent centuries, Greek slavery was not determined by ethnicity or skin color. Anyone could become enslaved through various paths of misfortune. The most common route into bondage was capture during warfare. When Greek city-states conquered neighboring territories, they frequently enslaved the defeated populations. Men, women, and children were marched from their homes, sometimes hundreds of miles, to be sold in slave markets across the Mediterranean. Debt was another cruel pathway into slavery, particularly in the earlier periods of Greek history. A poor harvest or unexpected expense could force a farmer to borrow money at exorbitant interest rates. When unable to repay, the debtor, and sometimes his entire family, would be enslaved to the creditor. This practice became so widespread and devastating to Athenian society that the statesman Solon enacted reforms around 594 BCE that abolished debt slavery for Athenian citizens. However, the practice continued in other Greek states, and for non-citizens even in Athens. Piracy also contributed significantly to the slave population. The Mediterranean Sea was rife with pirates who captured travelers and coastal villagers to sell in slave markets. These maritime bandits operated with near impunity, striking isolated communities and seizing anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. For those captured, their former lives ended abruptly as they were transported to distant lands, their identities erased and replaced with the single label of slave. Children born to enslaved mothers automatically inherited their status, regardless of who their father might be. Even if the father was a free man, or the master himself, the child would be born into bondage. This ensured that slavery was self-perpetuating, creating generations of enslaved people who never knew freedom. Some children were even abandoned by their parents and collected by slave traders, a practice called infant exposure that was tragically common in the ancient world. Once enslaved, individuals entered a world of profound powerlessness and vulnerability. Under Greek law, slaves were not considered persons, but rather living property, what Aristotle coldly termed a living tool. This classification had devastating implications for their treatment and quality of life. They had no legal rights, could not own property, could not marry legally, and had no protection against abuse or exploitation by their owners. The daily life of an enslaved person in ancient Greece varied dramatically depending on their specific circumstances. Urban slaves, particularly those owned by wealthy households, might work as domestic servants, attending to cooking, cleaning, childcare, and other household tasks. Some developed specialized skills as craftsmen, working alongside their masters in workshops producing pottery, metalwork, or textiles. Others served as teachers, scribes, or accountants if they had education or particular talents. While domestic slavery might seem less brutal than other forms, the reality was still deeply oppressive. Enslaved household servants worked from dawn until late at night, with little rest. They were constantly at the beck and call of their masters, expected to respond immediately to any demand. Privacy was non-existent, with slaves often sleeping in corridors or kitchens, their bodies always accessible to their owners. Female domestic slaves faced the additional burden of sexual exploitation, with masters believing they had absolute right to the bodies of those they owned. For enslaved men in urban settings, one of the most dreaded assignments was working in the mines, particularly the silver mines at Laurion, that funded Athens's powerful navy and public works. The conditions in these mines represented perhaps the worst form of slavery in ancient Greece, Workers descended into narrow, poorly ventilated shafts, sometimes hundreds of feet deep, where they would remain for shifts of 10 hours or more. By the light of small oil lamps, they chipped away at the rock face using primitive tools, inhaling toxic dust that gradually destroyed their lungs. The tunnels were often so narrow that workers had to crawl on their stomachs to reach the mining face. Summer brought suffocating heat, while winter offered no relief from the damp chill that penetrated the underground chambers. Cave-ins were common, burying workers alive with little hope of rescue. Overseers used whips to ensure constant productivity, driving the workers to extract maximum profit for their owners regardless of human cost. Most mining slaves survived only a few years before succumbing to accidents, disease, or exhaustion. Their bodies, worn down by the brutal conditions, were simply discarded and replaced with new captives. Archaeological evidence from the Lorien mines tells this grim story. Skeletal remains showing severe joint damage, chronic respiratory diseases, and injuries consistent with relentless physical labor started at very young ages. Agricultural slavery represented another harsh reality for many enslaved people in ancient Greece. On rural estates, enslaved workers toiled in the fields from sunrise to sunset, planting and harvesting crops in the unforgiving Mediterranean sun. They lived in crude barracks, often chained together at night to prevent escape. Their diet consisted of minimal rations, typically barley porridge, occasionally supplemented with olives, figs or small amounts of wine, heavily diluted with water. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant periods of crushing labor during planting and harvest, when enslaved workers might be forced to work nearly around the clock. During these critical times, overseers were particularly brutal, using whips and other punishments to extract maximum effort. The mortality rate among agricultural slaves was high, with many dying from heat stroke, disease, or injuries incurred during their punishing work. Public slaves, owned by the city-state rather than individuals, faced a somewhat different existence. In Athens, public slaves served as police officers, minor government officials, and maintenance workers for public buildings and roads. While still denied freedom, they often enjoyed slightly better conditions than privately owned slaves. Some could live separately from their masters, and were allowed to keep a portion of their earnings. However, they remained fundamentally unfree, subject to corporal punishment, and forced to perform whatever tasks the state demanded. Perhaps the most visible public slaves were those who served in the Scythian archer corps in Athens. These enslaved men, often of Scythian origin, from what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, maintained public order and carried out arrests. The irony of enslaved men enforcing laws they themselves had no protection under demonstrates the complex and contradictory nature of Greek slavery. For all enslaved people in ancient Greece, physical punishment was a constant threat that hung over daily life. Masters had nearly unlimited power to discipline their slaves as they saw fit. Whipping was the most common form of punishment, with specialized whips designed to inflict maximum pain. Some owners used wooden paddles, metal rods, or other implements to beat their slaves for perceived infractions or simply to assert dominance. More severe punishments included branding, where hot irons were pressed into the skin to mark slaves as runaways or troublemakers. Mutilation, the cutting off of ears, noses, or other body parts, served both as punishment and as a permanent visible marker of slave status. For the most serious offenses, such as attempting to escape or striking a master, execution was common. These executions were often performed in exceptionally cruel ways, such as crucifixion or being thrown from a cliff, to serve as warnings to other enslaved people. The psychological torment of slavery matched the physical brutality. Enslaved people lived with the constant knowledge that they had no control over their own lives or bodies. They could be sold away from family members at any moment, with children separated from parents and spouses from each other with no recourse. The names they had been given at birth were typically replaced with new ones chosen by their masters, erasing their cultural identities. They were frequently addressed as boy or you there, regardless of their age, a linguistic reinforcement of their dehumanized status. The ever-present threat of sexual violence added another layer of trauma, particularly for women and children. Female slaves were routinely exploited by their masters and sometimes rented out to others for profit. Greek vase paintings and literature contain numerous depictions of such abuse, presented casually as a normal aspect of slave ownership. Children born of these assaults would themselves be slaves, creating a generational cycle of trauma and bondage. While Greek society normalized slavery to the extent that even philosophers like Aristotle argued some people were slaves by nature, not all enslaved people accepted their condition passively. Resistance took many forms, from small daily acts of defiance to organized rebellions. Some engaged in work slowdowns, deliberately misunderstanding orders, or damaging tools and equipment. Others fled, despite the severe punishments for captured runaways, and the difficulty of surviving as a fugitive in a society where slaves were immediately recognizable by their dress, speech, and demeanor. The ultimate form of resistance was armed rebellion, though these were less common in mainland Greece than in other parts of the ancient world. The geography of Greece, with its small isolated communities, made large-scale slave revolts difficult to organize. However, historical records mention several significant uprisings, particularly in areas with high concentrations of enslaved people working in mines or on large agricultural estates. These rebellions were invariably met with overwhelming force and brutal reprisals, with captured rebels executed in spectacular public fashion to deter others. Some enslaved people found more subtle ways to assert their humanity within the confines of their bondage. They formed supportive communities among themselves, preserving cultural traditions and religious practices from their homelands. They created family bonds even when not legally recognized, and sometimes managed to save money through small side businesses in hopes of eventually purchasing their freedom. These acts of maintaining human dignity, in the face of systematic dehumanization, represent a profound form of resistance. The path to freedom for enslaved people in ancient Greece was narrow and precarious. Manumission, the formal release from slavery, was possible but relatively rare. Some masters freed slaves in their wills, either as a reward for faithful service or to enhance their own reputation for generosity after death. Others allowed slaves to purchase their freedom over time, though the prices set were often so high that it took decades of saving every spare coin to reach the required amount. Even when formally freed, former slaves occupied a tenuous position in Greek society. They became freedmen or freedwomen, neither slave nor citizen. In Athens, they were classified as metics, resident aliens, and required to have a former master as their legal patron. They paid special taxes, could not own land, and had limited legal protections. Their children, however, might eventually gain citizenship rights after several generations, gradually integrating into free society. Religious sanctuaries sometimes offered temporary refuge for escaped slaves. Certain temples, particularly those dedicated to healing gods like Asclepius, provided asylum where pursuers could not legally seize fugitives. However, this protection was limited and temporary, often serving only to delay recapture rather than secure permanent freedom. The scale of slavery in ancient Greece was staggering. Historians estimate that in classical Athens, slaves constituted between 30 to 40% of the total population. In some areas, particularly those with large mining operations or agricultural estates, enslaved people may have outnumbered the free population. This means that the magnificent achievements of Greek civilization, its architecture, philosophy, democracy, and art, were built quite literally on the backs of hundreds of thousands of enslaved human beings whose suffering made possible the leisure time that free citizens devoted to intellectual and cultural pursuits. The economic impact of slavery on Greek society cannot be overstated. Slave labor generated the surplus wealth that funded Athens' navy, public buildings, religious festivals, and democratic institutions. The famous silver owls, Athenian coins that became the dominant currency throughout the eastern Mediterranean, were mined by slaves working in conditions so brutal that most died within years. The olive oil and wine that Greece exported throughout the ancient world was largely produced by enslaved agricultural workers. This economic dependence on slavery helps explain why even the most progressive Greek thinkers rarely questioned the institution itself. Slavery was so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily life and the structure of the economy that few could imagine society without it. When Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, turned his mind to the question of slavery, he could only conclude that some people were naturally suited to be slaves, a rationalization that revealed the limits of even the most brilliant minds when confronted with the entrenched injustices of their own society. There were, however, a few dissenting voices. The Sophists, a group of traveling teachers and philosophers, sometimes argued that slavery was not natural, but merely a human convention. Alcidamas, a 4th century BCE rhetorician, reportedly claimed that God has set all men free. Nature has made no one a slave. The playwright Euripides, through characters in his tragedies, occasionally questioned the justice of slavery, suggesting that many slaves were equal or superior to their masters in virtue and intelligence. These critiques remained minority views, however, never gaining enough traction to seriously challenge the institution. Greek democracy, celebrated as the birthplace of Western political freedom, was in reality a freedom reserved for a small minority of adult male citizens. built upon and sustained by the unfreedom of the majority, women, foreigners, and most brutally, the enslaved. As night falls on our journey through the harsh realities of slavery in ancient Greece, we're left to contemplate the profound contradiction at the heart of this celebrated civilization. The same society that gave us enduring ideas about democracy, philosophy, and human excellence also created one of history's most comprehensive systems of human bondage. The marble temples and profound dialogues that we still admire were made possible by countless unnamed individuals who lived and died in conditions of extreme suffering and exploitation. Perhaps the most important lesson we can take from this exploration is the recognition of how thoroughly even brilliant societies can normalize profound injustice. The Greek philosophers who contemplated the good life and the nature of justice did so in homes maintained by people they owned as property. The citizens who gathered in the Athenian assembly to exercise their democratic rights returned to households and businesses dependent on unfree labor. This blindness to the fundamental contradiction between democratic ideals and slaveholding practice would echo throughout history, reappearing most notably in the American experiment, where founding fathers eloquently proclaimed that all men are created equal while owning human beings. The Greek experience reminds us that human societies have an immense capacity for compartmentalization, for celebrating principles of freedom and dignity, while simultaneously denying those same principles to many in their midst. As we reflect on the lives of the enslaved in ancient Greece, we should remember that behind the impersonal historical term slavery were millions of individual human beings with hopes, fears, families, and dreams, people who loved and suffered, resisted and endured. Their voices are largely absent from the historical record, as the surviving texts were written almost exclusively by the free and the elite. Yet through archaeological evidence, passing mentions in legal speeches, and careful reading between the lines of historical accounts, we can glimpse something of their experiences. In honoring their memory, we recognize that the magnificent achievements of Greek civilization came at an immeasurable human cost. The Parthenon, the dialogues of Plato, the plays of Sophocles, all were built upon a foundation of human suffering that no aesthetic or intellectual brilliance can justify. The enslaved people of ancient Greece, though they left few monuments and wrote few texts, are as much a part of that civilization's legacy as its most celebrated accomplishments. As we've seen throughout this journey, slavery in ancient Greece was not a peripheral institution, but a central one, not an unfortunate exception to Greek ideals, but in many ways their enabling condition. The leisure time that allowed citizens to participate in democracy, philosophy, and the arts was purchased with the stolen time and bodies of the enslaved. The wealth that built the magnificent temples and funded the famous festivals flowed from the uncompensated labor of people denied their most basic rights. This recognition does not require us to reject the valuable contributions of Greek civilization or to judge ancient societies by modern standards. Rather, it calls us to a more complete and honest reckoning with history, one that acknowledges both the brilliance and the brutality of past societies, that counts the costs as well as the achievements. In doing so, we honor the full humanity of those who lived before us, both the celebrated and the forgotten, both those who left their names on marble monuments and those whose names were lost to history, but whose labor made those monuments possible. The story of slavery in ancient Greece also reminds us that human progress is neither linear nor inevitable. Societies can simultaneously advance in some areas while maintaining or even intensifying oppression in others. The abolition of debt slavery for Athenian citizens under Solon, for instance, coincided with an increased reliance on chattel slavery of foreigners. This complex interplay of progress and regression, of freedom and unfreedom, characterizes much of human history. As we conclude our exploration of why it truly did suck to be enslaved in ancient Greece, we're reminded of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the most oppressive circumstances. Despite the brutal conditions they faced, enslaved people created communities, preserved cultural traditions, formed families, and sometimes found paths to freedom. Their struggles for dignity and autonomy, though often unsuccessful, represent an enduring testament to humanity's desire for freedom. The philosopher Epictetus, himself a former slave, would later write that while a master could control a person's body, they could not enslave the mind unless one allowed it. This philosophical resistance, the insistence on inner freedom, even when external freedom was denied, represents perhaps the most profound form of opposition to slavery's dehumanizing logic. In maintaining their sense of self-worth and humanity, despite society's attempt to reduce them to tools, enslaved people engaged in a quiet but powerful refutation of the system that bound them. As you drift towards sleep, I invite you to remember those countless individuals whose names we may never know, whose stories were not recorded, but whose lives and labors shaped the ancient world we study today. In acknowledging their suffering and their humanity, we take a small step toward restoring the dignity that was denied them in life, and perhaps we also sharpen our ability to recognize and resist the dehumanizing forces that continue to exist in our own world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darker chapters. Though the subject has been difficult, I hope it has provided food for thought and a deeper understanding of the complex legacy of ancient Greek civilization. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your understanding of history ever more complete and humane. As we've seen, the institution of slavery in ancient Greece was not a peripheral phenomenon, but a fundamental part of society's structure, touching every aspect of daily life and economy. To more fully understand the experience of enslaved people, let's explore some specific contexts where slavery was particularly brutal, beginning with the notorious silver mines of Laurion. Located about 50 kilometers southeast of Athens, the Laurion mines were the source of the silver that funded Athens' rise as a naval power and its golden age of cultural achievement. By the 5th century BCE, an estimated 20,030 slaves worked in these mines under conditions so horrific that they represent perhaps the most extreme form of exploitation in the ancient Greek world. The workday for mining slaves began before dawn. Shackled in groups and guarded by overseers armed with whips, they marched from sparse barracks to the mine entrances. The initial descent was often through narrow vertical shafts, where workers climbed down using small footholds cut into the rock. Once below ground, they navigated a maze of tunnels, some barely wide enough for a human body to squeeze through. The actual mining was done with simple iron tools, picks, hammers, and chisels. Workers would chip away at the rock face for hours on end, filling baskets with ore that other slaves would carry to the surface. The tunnels, inadequately supported by wooden beams, frequently collapsed, burying workers alive. Ventilation was poor to non-existent, with air becoming increasingly toxic the deeper one went. The oil lamps used for light consumed precious oxygen while filling the confined space with smoke. Temperature and humidity created additional torments. In summer, the deeper tunnels could reach suffocating temperatures, while in winter, workers often stood in ankle-deep water in the cold and damp. These conditions, combined with minimal rest and poor nutrition, led to rampant disease. Respiratory ailments were particularly common. Silicosis from inhaling rock dust gradually destroyed the lungs, causing a slow, painful decline. The mining slaves worked until they physically could not continue, typically only a few years. When they became too weak or ill to be productive, they were often simply left to die. Archaeological examinations of skeletal remains from the Laurion area reveal bodies broken by toil, spines deformed from constant bending in low tunnels, bones showing signs of healing and re-breaking from frequent injuries, teeth worn down from gritting against pain and exertion. Perhaps most disturbing was the casual economic calculation behind this brutality. Mine owners determined that it was more profitable to work slaves to death and replace them than to maintain them in better conditions for longer service. The regular influx of new captives from warfare and piracy meant that human life was cheaper than the cost of humane treatment. This cold arithmetic reveals the fundamental horror of slavery, the reduction of human beings to disposable tools whose suffering was irrelevant to the profit they generated. While the mines represented the most extreme form of exploitation, agricultural slavery was more widespread and sustained the economic foundation of Greek society. Large estates, particularly in regions like Thessaly, employed dozens or even hundreds of slaves to cultivate wheat, olives, and grapes. These agricultural slaves lived in conditions that in some ways paralleled the plantation slavery of much later periods. Rural slaves typically lived in barracks, under constant supervision. During planting and harvest seasons, they might work from dawn until well after dark, with overseers using whips to maintain the pace. Their diet was minimal, primarily barley porridge, maza, with occasional additions of olive oil, vegetables, or small amounts of cheese. Meat was rare to non-existent in their diet, and the wine they received was heavily watered down, more to prevent dehydration than to provide enjoyment. The Mediterranean climate added to their suffering. Summer fieldwork meant laboring under the relentless sun, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 Celsius. Heat stroke was common, and death from dehydration not unknown. Winter brought different challenges: cold rain, mud, and the constant dampness that led to respiratory infections and other illnesses. For agricultural slaves, physical punishment was routine. Whipping for perceived laziness or disobedience served both as discipline and as a demonstration of the master's absolute power. More severe punishments included branding, usually on the forehead, to mark repeated escapees. Some agricultural slaves were kept permanently in chains, particularly those working in remote areas where escape might be easier. The isolation of rural slavery added a psychological dimension to its harshness. Unlike urban slaves, who might interact with various people and occasionally find opportunities for socializing, agricultural slaves were often cut off from the wider world. Their social contact was limited to fellow slaves and the overseers who controlled them. This isolation made organizing resistance more difficult and escape less feasible, as fugitives had nowhere to blend in. Even within the generally oppressive system of slavery, the experience of enslaved women deserves special attention for its added layer of gender-based exploitation. Female slaves in ancient Greece faced not only the burden of forced labor, but also pervasive sexual abuse and reproductive control. In wealthy households, enslaved women performed domestic tasks like cooking, cleaning, and childcare. They also worked as spinners and weavers, producing the textiles that clothed the household and provided income through sale. This work was constant and physically demanding, with women expected to maintain productivity from early morning until late at night. Beyond this labor, female slaves were considered sexually available to their masters as a matter of course. Greek law and custom placed no restrictions on an owner's sexual use of his slaves. Rape was not recognized as a crime when the victim was enslaved. It was considered at most a property offense against the owner if the perpetrator was someone other than the master himself. Vase paintings and literary references casually depict such exploitation, indicating how normalized it was in Greek society. For enslaved women, pregnancy resulting from this abuse created additional hardships. If they gave birth, their children became the property of their master, perpetuating the cycle of slavery. Some owners encouraged childbearing as a means of increasing their human property, without the expense of purchasing new slaves. Others considered pregnancy an unwanted interruption to a slave's work, and might force abortions or separate mothers from their newborns. Some enslaved women were explicitly purchased for sexual exploitation, particularly in brothels. Athens had numerous such establishments, ranging from relatively expensive houses, catering to wealthy clients, to sordid facilities serving the poorest members of society. Women in these settings might be forced to service dozens of men daily, with all earnings going to their owners. Their lives were often short, ended by disease, violence, or suicide. Even the famous hetairai, often romanticized as sophisticated courtesans, who entertained men with conversation and music as well as sex, were frequently enslaved women. While a few managed to earn enough to purchase their freedom and achieve some independence, most remained in bondage, their apparent luxury and accomplishments serving only to increase their value as property. For all enslaved people in ancient Greece, the psychological impact of their condition was as devastating as the physical hardships. The constant knowledge that one was considered not fully human, that one's body, labor, and even children belonged to another, created a form of trauma that we can only begin to comprehend. The erasure of identity was a fundamental aspect of this trauma. Upon enslavement, people lost not only their freedom but often their names, replaced with designations chosen by their new owners. They were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their original religions, or maintain their cultural traditions. This forced assimilation aimed to break connections to their former lives and communities, making resistance less likely and control more complete. The lack of legal personhood meant that slaves had no recourse against abuse. They could not testify in court except under torture, based on the belief that only pain would compel them to speak truth. They had no right to family integrity, with parents, children, and spouses routinely separated by sale. They could form no legally recognized marriages, even among themselves, and any relationships they developed existed only at their master's sufferance. Perhaps most insidious was the way Greek society rationalized this system of exploitation. The belief that some people were naturally suited to slavery, that they lacked the rational capacity for self-governance, provided an ideological justification for treating human beings as tools. This dehumanization was reinforced through language, with slaves commonly referred to using neuter terms that denied them even grammatical personhood. Against this background of oppression, many enslaved people found ways to resist and maintain their humanity. Some engaged in everyday forms of resistance, working slowly, pretending not to understand commands, or subtly sabotaging their master's property. Others built clandestine communities among themselves, preserving elements of their cultures and creating networks of mutual support that helped them survive. Flight was the most direct form of resistance, though success was rare. Escaped slaves faced enormous challenges. They had nowhere to go where slavery didn't exist, no legal identity, and were immediately recognizable by their speech, mannerisms, and often by brands or other marks. Those who were recaptured faced severe punishment, from brutal beatings to execution. More organized resistance occasionally erupted into rebellion, particularly in areas with high concentrations of slaves. While nothing in mainland Greece matched the scale of the famous Spartacus rebellion in Roman Italy, historical records mention several significant uprisings. These were invariably met with overwhelming force and savage reprisals, but they demonstrate that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, enslaved people refused to accept their condition as natural or inevitable. Some found more subtle paths to agency within the system. Skilled slaves, those working as craftsmen, merchants, or administrators, sometimes managed to accumulate peculium, money or goods that their masters allowed them to keep. This could eventually be used to purchase freedom, though the price was typically set high enough that it took years or decades to accumulate the necessary amount. Religion offered another avenue for psychological resistance. Many enslaved people maintained their traditional spiritual practices in secret, finding in them a source of identity and dignity that their masters could not fully erase. Some Greek religious festivals even provided temporary inversions of the social order, with slaves briefly enjoying freedoms and privileges normally denied them, a safety valve that helped prevent more serious unrest while offering momentary relief from bondage. For a small minority, education became a form of resistance and potential path to improve status. Some urban slaves, particularly those owned by wealthy or intellectual masters, gained access to learning that could later serve them well. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus began life as a slave, as did Aesop, the legendary creator of fables. These exceptional cases, while not representative of the typical slave experience, demonstrate how some individuals managed to transcend their legal status through intellectual achievement. The legacy of Greek slavery extends far beyond the ancient world. The philosophical justifications developed by thinkers like Aristotle would be revived centuries later to defend the Atlantic slave trade and American plantation slavery. The economic model of extracting maximum profit from unfree labor has reappeared in different forms throughout history. Even the language we use to discuss freedom and citizenship bears the imprint of ancient Greek concepts that were developed in a society founded on unfreedom. By confronting the reality of slavery in ancient Greece, we gain not only a more accurate understanding of that civilization, but also insight into the persistent human capacity for both cruelty and resistance. We see how even societies that produce magnificent cultural and intellectual achievements can simultaneously maintain systems of extreme exploitation. And we recognize that the struggle for human dignity and freedom has a long history, with each generation facing its own version of the fundamental question: who deserves to be treated as fully human? As our exploration of slavery in ancient Greece draws to a close, we're left with a complex legacy to contemplate. The democracy, philosophy, art, and literature that we celebrate as Greek contributions to world civilization were inextricably bound up with a system that denied basic humanity to a large portion of the population. The leisure that allowed citizens to participate in politics and intellectual life was purchased with the forced labor of others. The wealth that built the Parthenon and funded the dramatic festivals came largely from resources extracted by enslaved workers. This recognition need not diminish our appreciation for the genuine achievements of Greek civilization, but it should complicate it. The same society that gave us concepts of democracy, philosophical inquiry, also provides one of history's clearest examples of how thoroughly even thoughtful people can normalize profound injustice when it benefits them. This paradox offers a humbling reminder of the blindnesses that can affect any society, including our own. Perhaps most importantly, centering the experiences of enslaved people in our understanding of ancient Greece helps restore some measure of historical visibility to those who were systematically silenced in their own time. Though we know relatively few of their names and have almost none of their own words, that we can acknowledge their crucial role in building the civilization we study and the immense suffering they endured. In doing so, we recognize that history belongs not just to the powerful and privileged, but to all who lived it, that the story of humanity includes both those who enjoyed freedom and those who were denied it. As you drift towards sleep, consider the countless individuals who lived and died in bondage in ancient Greece, people who loved and hoped, suffered and resisted, maintaining their humanity in a system designed to deny it. Their stories, though incompletely told, are an essential part of understanding both the ancient world and our own. In acknowledging them, we take a small step toward the more complete and honest reckoning with history that all people deserve. Though the night grows late and our journey comes to an end, the echoes of these lives continue to resonate through time. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you awaken with a deeper appreciation for both the achievements and the failures of our shared human past. Until next time, this is Nap to History, wishing you restful sleep and thoughtful reflections on the complex tapestry of human experience that connects us all across the centuries. As we've explored the brutal realities of slavery in ancient Greece, we've focused primarily on Athens and other mainland Greek cities. But the Greek world extended far beyond these boundaries, encompassing colonies and settlements throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. In these more distant territories, slavery often took on distinct forms that reflected local conditions and practices. In Syracuse, a powerful Greek colony on Sicily, agricultural slavery reached industrial scales that prefigured the plantation systems of much later eras. Vast estates called latifundia employed hundreds or even thousands of slaves to produce grain, olive oil, and wine for export. These operations were notorious for their harsh conditions, with slaves working in chain gangs under the supervision of mounted overseers. The desperate rebellions that occasionally erupted in these areas were crushed with exceptional brutality, with captured rebels commonly crucified along roadsides as warnings to others. In the Greek cities of Ionia, western coast of modern Turkey, slavery was deeply intertwined with international trade networks. These cities served as major hubs for the slave trade, with merchants bringing captives from the Black Sea region, Thrace, and the interior of Asia Minor to be sold throughout the Greek world. The scale of this commerce was staggering. Tens of thousands of human beings passed through these markets annually, torn from their homelands and dispersed across the Mediterranean basin. The island of Chios developed a particularly notorious reputation for its treatment of enslaved people. Chios slave owners were known for branding their human property on the face, a practice considered extreme even by the standards of the time. The island was also a center for the training of enslaved people for specialized roles, with young captives molded through a combination of instruction and brutality into the skills their masters required, whether domestic service, craft production, or entertainment. The variations in slavery across the Greek world remind us that even within a broadly shared cultural context, the specific forms of exploitation could vary significantly based on local economies, resources, and traditions. What remained constant, however, was the fundamental denial of personhood to enslaved people, their classification as property rather than human beings with inherent rights and dignity. This dehumanization was reflected in and reinforced by Greek language and literature. In the works of poets, playwrights, and philosophers, slaves frequently appear as stock characters, objects of humor for their supposed stupidity or cowardice, background figures whose suffering merits no comment, or simply as animated tools that enable the more interesting lives of their masters. Even when sympathetically portrayed, as occasionally happens in the tragedies of Euripides, enslaved characters serve primarily to illuminate the moral dilemmas or emotional states of free citizens, rather than being fully realized individuals in their own right. Greek comedy, particularly the works of Aristophanes, often treated the abuse of slaves as a source of humor. Scenes of slaves being beaten, threatened, or humiliated were played for laughs, normalizing violence against the unfree as natural and entertaining. This cultural representation both reflected and reinforced the social reality that placed enslaved people outside the moral community, beings to whom normal ethical considerations did not apply. In Greek literature and art, we occasionally glimpse moments of recognition that cut against this dehumanization. In Homer's Odyssey, the loyal swineherd Eumaeus is given his own story and portrayed with dignity despite his enslaved status. Some vase paintings depict enslaved people with individualized features and expressions, hinting at the artist's recognition of their subjects' humanity. These exceptions, however, only highlight the general pattern of erasure and objectification that characterized most cultural representations of slavery. The psychological dynamics of the master-slave relationship in ancient Greece reveal much about how systems of extreme inequality are maintained and justified. For those who owned slaves, a complex set of psychological mechanisms helped reconcile their self-image as civilized, rational beings with their participation in a system of brutal exploitation. Distancing was a key strategy, both physical and conceptual. The worst forms of slavery, such as mining and agricultural gang labor, typically took place away from urban centers where citizens conducted their political and intellectual lives. This geographical separation allowed free Greeks to avoid direct confrontation with the most disturbing aspects of the system that supported their way of life. Conceptual distancing operated through the theories mentioned earlier, the notion that some people were naturally suited to slavery, that they lacked the full rational capacities of citizens, or that they came from cultures inherently disposed to servitude. These ideas, articulated most systematically by Aristotle but widely shared throughout Greek society, provided an intellectual framework that normalized what might otherwise appear as naked exploitation. For the enslaved themselves, survival often required a form of psychological adaptation to seemingly inescapable circumstances. Some internalized the dehumanizing messages of the society around them, accepting their inferior status as natural or deserved. Others maintained an inner sense of dignity and identity that contradicted their external condition, creating what the scholar James C. Scott has called a hidden transcript: thoughts, beliefs, and values that could not be safely expressed in the presence of the powerful, but that sustained a sense of selfhood and even resistance. The presence of freed slaves, epeleutheroi, in Greek society created additional complexities in the system. These individuals, having been formally manumitted by their owners, occupied an ambiguous middle status, neither slave nor citizen. In Athens, they became metics, resident aliens, with limited rights and continued obligations to their former masters, who became their legal patrons. They could not own land, participate in politics, or marry citizens, but they could work independently, own property, and in some cases achieve considerable prosperity. The existence of this intermediate category served several functions in maintaining the overall system of slavery. It provided a potential path to improved status that could motivate slaves to work diligently and remain loyal in hopes of eventual manumission. It created a class of people who, having experienced slavery firsthand, often became its most fervent defenders once they achieved some measure of freedom, a phenomenon observed in many slaveholding societies throughout history. And it helped reinforce the idea that slavery was not a permanent, inherent condition, but rather a status that individuals might enter or leave based on circumstances and merit, a concept that made the institution seem more flexible and less unjust than it actually was. For most enslaved people in ancient Greece, however, manumission remained an unattainable dream. The vast majority lived and died in bondage, their labor and suffering providing the foundation for a civilization that celebrated freedom and human achievement, while systematically denying both to a large portion of its population. This fundamental contradiction between the ideals Greek society professed and the reality it practiced offers perhaps the most important lesson for us today. It reminds us that human societies have an enormous capacity for compartmentalization, for simultaneously advancing noble principles in some domains, while violating those same principles in others. It challenges us to examine our own societies more critically, to ask where similar contradictions might exist in our economic systems, social arrangements, and cultural assumptions. As our exploration of slavery in ancient Greece comes to a close, we're left with a more complete, if more disturbing, understanding of this celebrated civilization. We recognize that the achievements we admire, the philosophical dialogues, the democratic experiments, the architectural and artistic masterpieces, were made possible by a system of exploitation that caused immense human suffering. We acknowledge that the leisure that allowed citizens to engage in politics and intellectual pursuit was purchased with the stolen time and labor of people denied their basic humanity. This recognition does not require us to abandon what is valuable in the Greek legacy, but it does call us to a more honest reckoning with the full reality of the past. It reminds us that human history is not a simple story of heroes and villains, of civilized achievements and barbaric failures, but rather a complex tapestry in which creativity and cruelty, wisdom and blindness, progress and regression are often inextricably intertwined. Most importantly, by centering the experiences of enslaved people in our understanding of ancient Greece, we restore some measure of historical visibility to those who were systematically silenced in their own time. Though their individual names and stories are largely lost to us, their collective experience forms an essential part of the historical record. Their labor built the temples we admire. Their exploitation generated the wealth that funded the arts we celebrate, and their suffering stands as a testament to the human capacity for both endurance and resistance in the face of oppression. As you drift towards sleep, I invite you to carry with you this more complex, more honest understanding of ancient Greece, one that acknowledges both its remarkable achievements and its profound moral failures. In doing so, perhaps we can develop a more nuanced relationship with our shared human past, drawing inspiration from its highest moments while learning from its darkest chapters. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but important journey through one of history's darker realities. Though the subject has been challenging, I hope it has provided food for thought and a deeper understanding of the complex legacy of ancient Greek civilization. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your waking hours filled with compassion and clarity. The stark realities of slavery in ancient Greece remind us that historical narratives are often selectively remembered and retold, with the voices and experiences of the most vulnerable frequently erased. As we've explored the lives of enslaved people in Greek society, we've confronted an uncomfortable truth that one of the most celebrated civilizations in human history, credited with laying the foundations for democracy, philosophy, and scientific inquiry, was built upon and sustained by a system of extreme exploitation and dehumanization. This contradiction should give us pause as we consider how we memorialize and learn from the past. The traditional narrative of ancient Greece as the cradle of Western civilization, or the birthplace of democratic values, tells only a partial truth. It centers the experiences and achievements of a small minority, free adult male citizens, while marginalizing or completely ignoring the majority population who did not enjoy these celebrated freedoms. A more complete understanding of ancient Greece requires us to hold these contradictory truths simultaneously. That brilliant philosophical insights emerged from a society that justified the ownership of human beings. That democratic principles developed in a community where only a small fraction had political rights. That magnificent artistic and architectural achievements were made possible by the forced labor and suffering of countless individuals whose names we will never know. This fuller historical perspective does not ask us to reject what was valuable and enduring in Greek contributions to human knowledge and culture. Rather, it invites us to approach the past with greater humility and nuance, recognizing both the remarkable achievements and the profound moral failures of earlier societies. It reminds us that human progress has rarely been straightforward or universal, that advances in one domain often coincided with stagnation or regression in others. Most importantly, by acknowledging the centrality of slavery to ancient Greek society, we honor the humanity of those who were denied it in their lifetimes. We recognize that the story of Greece belongs not only to the philosophers, statesmen, and artists whose words and works have been preserved, but equally to the miners, field workers, domestic servants, and other enslaved people whose labor made those achievements possible. As you drift towards sleep, I invite you to reflect on how this more complete understanding of ancient Greece might inform our approach to history more broadly. How might we better integrate the experiences of the marginalized and exploited into our historical narratives? How can we acknowledge the contributions and suffering of those whose voices were silenced? And how might a more honest reckoning with the past help us build a more just and humane future? Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's more challenging chapters. Though the subject has been difficult, I hope it has provided valuable insights and a deeper understanding of our shared human past. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your historical perspective ever more complete and compassionate. Good night.